2000, my wife and I were living in Teesside in the north of England, and in a time of prayer, the Lord gave me a vision, and in the vision I saw what would be described as something about the size of a plot of land about the size of a tennis court. And on this tennis court there were a load of people, and they were building a structure on top of the tennis court. And as they were building, I could see that they were fashioning pieces of wood, and they were adding to this massive structure that was being built over the top of this tennis court. And what would happen was, they'd fashion these pieces of wood, and then they'd come and they'd add it to the structure. It looked a bit like a giant greenhouse with no glass. And then they'd all gather in the middle, and they'd pray together and ask God to fill the house. And nothing would happen, and they were really earnest for God to do this, but nothing happened. So then they'd go off and they'd fashion another piece of wood to add to the structure, and they'd go again into the middle and pray again. And this went on for quite a while. And then I heard a noise. Initially it just sounded like just noise, and then as this noise got closer, I could hear that it was people actually shouting. And as they got closer and closer and closer, this massive crowd of people began to shout, and what I could hear them shouting was, "There's a new church," or "There's a new church," and they came smashing through this structure. And as they smashed through the structure, the people that were in the midst of building it responded in different ways. Some of them, they responded with anger because they'd been working really hard to establish this thing. Others just fell on the floor in dismay at what had been pulled, what was being destroyed. Others, it was quite comical. They grabbed a handful of the demolished pieces, and I saw them run off to somewhere else to try and build what they had been building again. And then there was another group, and the other group, they joined this crowd of people, and they began to move with this crowd of people. And the thing that was really inspiring about it was there was nothing that was structured about it in the sense of it being static, but it was fluid, it was moving, it was obviously, it was people, it wasn't a building, so it was alive. And then I heard the Lord say this, I won't feel that which has been built by the hands of men, but I'll only feel that which has been offered by my Spirit. And I understood that the Lord was speaking about what he's going to do with the church in this next season of time. So in one sense, there's not a new church, because there's obviously only one church. But what there is the time that we're living in, there's a new season and a new expression of church that is new to us, but wouldn't have been new to the disciples, because that was the church that they grew up in. And as I was praying over this image, the Lord spoke to me, and this is what he said to me. He says, if you had your hand and your forefinger and your thumb were missing, the other three fingers of the hand would have to compensate for the absence of the thumb and the forefinger. But the moment that if you could add the thumb and the forefinger onto the hand, then the whole function of the hand would change, because now something new had been added. So now the other three fingers, their roles were redefined because of the arrival of the forefinger and the thumb. And I understood from this that what the Lord was saying was that he was speaking about what Paul spoke about in Ephesians 2:20, where he says that the church is built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. Now, we've lived through quite a long period of time, certainly in the UK and probably in other parts of the Western world, where the church has not been built upon fivefold ministry. And it's certainly not had an established presence of apostolic prophetic foundations in the church. So as a result, the church has been pastorally driven. It's had good teachers, it's had evangelists, but the apostle and prophet has not been there. And now what's happened is now we're beginning to realise that God's wanting to add that to the church. And in my own experience over these last 2 years, 2 years ago, the Lord spoke to Joe and I and said that we're to take what was City Gates Church at the time and amalgamate it with an Anglican church in the city, which was actually the church that I was saved in 24 years ago, because the Lord wanted us to help establish the prophetic in the church. Now, John McGinley, who's a dear friend and the vicar of the church, is strongly apostolic. I'm strongly prophetic. So as we've begun to work together, we've had to begin to outline and work out what it means to have prophetic and apostolic foundations in the church, because although on the most part we've all probably read the text and we've all seen it, I don't know that yet we've actually seen it in operation and in practice. So we're really learning on the job. And when you talk about prophetic and apostolic foundations in the church, what we're not talking about, I'm going to really major on the prophetic, but what we're not talking about when we talk about prophetic foundations, just because there's 2 or 3 people in the church that bring a prophecy, that doesn't mean that the church has prophetic foundations. Just because maybe there's prophetic appointments running in your church that people can come and receive prophetic words, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are prophetic apostolic foundations. When I'm talking about prophetic apostolic foundations, what I'm talking about is rather than just the operation of the gift, but I'm talking about the environment that the office of prophet and the office of apostle creates. So by even the language that Paul uses where he talks about it being foundational, if you think about foundations, foundations are the thing that underpins everything else. Everything else is built on top of it. If you were to think that apostle and prophet were lights that were underneath a fish tank, and one light was blue and the other light was green, and you lit them up underneath, the entire colour of the fish tank would change because of these 2 lights shining through the atmosphere of the fish tank, for want of a better word. So in the same way, when we're talking about apostolic prophetic foundations, what we're talking about is the environment of the church. It's the atmosphere of the church. It's the atmosphere in which all of the other gifts work. So when you talk about apostolic prophetic foundations, you're talking about the underpinning, driving values of the church. Now, this is a challenge to us because of the fact that we're all familiar, although we're probably not aware of it, with a pastorally driven church or a pastorally led church. And the nature of the pastoral gift is to keep the church safe, is to look after the sheep and protect the sheep and feed the sheep. And it is by nature a very introverted gift because that's what it's called to do. It's called to look after the welfare of the church. Whereas the apostolic and the prophetic, the way that I've started to translate those 2 terms just purely for understanding's sake, is if you were to say that the apostolic is the strategic builder and the prophetic is the strategic seer, you can see that if those 2 gifts are absent, then many times there's going to be a lack of progress in the church, and the church is going to become very comfortable and very static. And what God is doing right now in the Western church, and probably particularly in the UK, is he's bringing about this massive shift of thinking. And if we're honest, none of us like change. Change is exciting when you preach about it. Change is exciting when you prophesy about it, as long as it's not us that are being expected to make the changes. So one of the things that we've got to do is we now move into this new season where God is adding or if you like, restoring the prophetic and the apostolic foundations of the church, is we've got to learn to do church again. We've got to learn what it looks like to be a teacher in the environment of apostolic prophetic grace. We've got to learn what it means to be a pastor in that environment, what it means to be an evangelist in that environment. And for the prophets, many prophets have operated and they've divorced themselves from the church because the fact that the church hasn't known how to pastor them, that hasn't known how to respond to them, and there's been a fracture. And God's now in the business of bringing about a restoration, that we see a reconciliation of these 2 gifts in the church so that we can begin to see the church really begin to flourish and grow. And the thing that we're experiencing at Holy Trinity in practice is the realization of how apostolic grace and prophetic grace work. And it's been a surprising journey because I think in the back of my mind, I was thinking that it was going to look like I was going to be giving prophetic words on a Sunday and people are going to get excited by that, and that would be what would happen. That would be the primary. In actual fact, that's not been the case. What's happened is a lot of the prophetic words that I'm giving are never being shared publicly, but what they're doing is they're creating an environment where then John as the apostle is saying, okay, how can I now implement this so that we can move forward as a body. So it's a partnership, and we're working together to build together. So the prophet comes along, and the prophet hears the word of the Lord, and then the apostle says, okay, so that's what this means from a missional point of view. The pastor then comes along and says, okay, so this is what it means from the church health point of view. And then the teacher says, okay, this is how we're going to teach it. And the evangelist uses it to fuel his mission towards bringing the lost into the kingdom. So we really need to look at everything that we're doing right now as church, and we need to ask ourselves the question, what of this is the old, and what of this is the new, and what of the old is going to transfer into the new? And that's a challenge to us, because what's familiar to us, we do by default. And when we're called to actually move into a new season and begin to operate a different way, it can be very easy to just default back to what we're familiar with. So I think God's challenge to us in this season is for us to understand that He really is, I mean, it's almost a coy term, the Lord is doing a new thing. And many times that statement's made, the Lord is doing a new thing. And what actually happens is the old thing is just done with more enthusiasm. But in this season, there really is a new thing happening. And across the nation, there really is a new move of the Spirit beginning. And I believe that the foundation to this being sustained, our ability to keep in the flow of the Spirit and to build with the Holy Spirit, is going to be very much rooted in whether or not we're building according to the biblical pattern, as opposed to what history has created, that it's okay for somebody to stand up and say, I'm a pastor, or I'm a teacher, or even I'm an evangelist, but woe betide you if you stand up and say you're an apostle, or if you're a prophet. And we've got to break that model. We've got to throw out some of the misapplications of the model. We've got to recognise that some of the practices and even the style in which gifts have operated have been unhelpful. And for your local setting, for my local setting, we've got to ask questions like, what does fivefold ministry operating look like for us? What does a prophet look like in our environment? What does an apostle look like in our environment? What does a church look like that's flourishing in the fivefold ministry gifts? And that's a question that everybody needs to answer. And I think right now, it wouldn't be unfair to say that I'm not aware of, maybe there is a church somewhere, but I'm not aware of a church yet, in the UK at least, where we could really say that's being modelled. But that's what God's calling us to model right now. That we've gone through this season of restoration where we've seen a strong line of teaching about the gift of the office of prophet, and a strong line of teaching about the office of apostle. And we obviously already had considerable understanding of the other three, but now we're coming into the place where God wants us to understand the shape and operation of the whole hand and what that looks like in practice. So as you're thinking about this, I want to really encourage you to pray and ask the question, what does our church look like in practice when apostolic and prophetic foundations are beginning to function correctly? I've got a fish tank behind the camera there, in a fish pond in the back garden. And one of the things you discover when you keep fish is you don't actually keep fish, you keep water. And if you keep the water well, the fish will flourish. That if the water's well oxygenated and clear of toxins, then the environment produces a healthy environment where the fish begin to flourish, they begin to breed and reproduce and grow. And that's what we want, and that's what the fivefold ministry is called to do. Their primary role, be it apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher, is to create an environment like the fish tank where the water is so perfect that the fish begin to flourish. That the whole drive behind all of the gifts is to see the body of Christ equipped. And there's a big difference between teaching somebody and equipping somebody. When you teach somebody, they gain information. When you equip somebody, you give them ability. You actually activate them. And the challenge that we've had over recent seasons is, because of the church has been pastorally driven and teacher driven, the nature of the teaching has not been focused upon equipping. It's not been focused on activating, because the prophet if you like, his primary or her primary role is in the area of activation, really. That's why Paul said to Timothy, fan into flame the gift that is within you through the laying on of my hands. And then elsewhere he says, I give you this instruction in line with the prophecies that you've received. So you see there that there's an activation there. And then in Romans 1, speaking to the Christians in Rome, he says, I long to see you that I might impart to you some spiritual gift, that which is lacking in your faith. So his whole drive was towards activation and movement. So although teaching's great and it creates the foundation, we need to move from teaching to training to activation so that we can begin to see every believer empowered, every believer fruitful, whether they be working in the church or whether they be working in the marketplace. They're beginning to understand how fivefold ministry can affect that environment. And some fivefold ministry gifts are actually going to be called to function in that environment primarily. So I've already recently met a teacher who's clearly an apostle, but she's working in the marketplace, if you like, in the area of teaching. So some of you, you're called into a fivefold ministry gift, but not primarily in the context of the church on a Sunday. It's actually out in the world. So as we begin to move forward now, God's going to unwrap what this looks like. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope it might just provoke you to just have a bit of a think and a pray about what about your environment has been pastorally driven, and what's it going to look like for the other three fingers to redefine their function as we begin to see apostolic and prophetic foundations restored to the church. God bless you, and I'll see you soon. Bye.